Hoi, New Year's Eve. The city is packed for the midnight countdown. Light snow falls. Streetlights reflect on cold, wet pavement. A single father walks home, holding his young son's hand. Nearby, a luxury woman stands by her car, trembling with anger. Her high-end supercar is dead, frozen in the freezing night. The man stops. He asks softly, "Need help, ma'am?" She looks him up and down, eyes filled with distrust. Her reply is short, "I can handle it." But the wind bites harder. Midnight is ticking closer. She has no idea. This offer redefines his entire life. The wind howled through the concrete canyons of the city, carrying with it the sharp scent of ozone and the distant roar of a million people celebrating. Mark Dawson pulled his collar up, but the thin fabric of his jacket was no match for the biting January air. Beside him, his 8-year-old son, Noah, was trying to be brave. The boy's boots were worn at the soles and his hands were tucked deep into his pockets, clutched around a plastic toy watch that hadn't ticked in weeks. "Are we almost home, Daddy?" Noah asked, his voice shivering. Mark looked down, his heart aching. "Just a few more blocks, buddy. Then we'll have our own countdown. I've got those pastries from the bakery, remember?" They were walking because the subway was packed and a taxi was a luxury Mark couldn't afford. 41 years old, a former genius reduced to working 3 manual labor jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. Mark was a ghost in this city, one of the thousands of unskilled workers who kept the gears turning while the elite looked right through them. But tonight, the gears of the elite had ground to a halt. Mark remembered a time when he was the one behind the high-gloss mahogany desks, calculating thermal dynamics for hydrogen-electric hybrids. He remembered the smell of expensive espresso and the hum of server rooms. That life felt like a fever dream now, buried under the weight of hospital bills and the crushing silence of a home that was missing its heart. His wife, Elena, had been the light of his life, and when her illness struck, the corporate machine didn't see a grieving husband. It saw a variable of inefficiency. In the middle of the deserted industrial stretch they used as a shortcut, a matte black Aventador sat paralyzed under a flickering streetlight. Standing beside it was Victoria Lang. At 35, she was the undisputed queen of the tech world, a woman whose face graced every business magazine. Tonight she was dressed in a silk gown that cost more than Mark's annual rent, her diamonds reflecting the cold neon of a nearby billboard. She was frantic. "Pick up, damn it!" she hissed into her phone. But the holiday network congestion was relentless. Her driver was stuck 10 miles away in a gridlock. Her roadside assistance was on a 3-hour delay. To Victoria, this car wasn't just a vehicle, it was an extension of her ego. It was a $500,000 statement that she was faster, better, and more powerful than the world around her. And right now, that statement was a dead weight in a dark alley. As Mark and Noah approached, the contrast was jarring. The billionaire and the beggar. Victoria saw them and immediately stiffened, her hand moving instinctively toward her purse. She had been taught to view the world in 2 categories, those who create value and those who consume it. To her, the man in the ragged coat clearly belonged to the latter. "Ma'am," Mark called out, keeping a respectful distance. "I couldn't help but notice the engine sound earlier. It sounded like a fuel trim malfunction before it died. Do you need a hand?" Victoria looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the grease-stained fingernails, the faded jeans, and the tired eyes. She saw a man she would usually cross the street to avoid. "I have the best security and the best mechanics on call," she snapped, her voice trembling more from cold than anger. "I don't need a hobbyist. I can handle it myself. Go away before I call the police." Noah looked up at the shiny car, then at the pretty lady. "My daddy can fix anything," he whispered, his voice filled with a purity that only a child can possess. "He even fixed the moon once in my dreams." Mark smiled sadly at his son, then turned back to Victoria. "It's New Year's Eve, Ms. Lang. In 20 minutes, the city will be at a standstill. I'm not looking for money. I just don't think a child or a lady should be out here in this cold when the fix might be simple. I know this engine. I know it better than the people who sold it to you." Victoria hesitated. The silence of the dead engine was deafening. She looked at the time. 11:42 p.m. Her arrogance was warring with her desperation. She thought about the gala she was supposed to attend, the investors she needed to impress, and the freezing wind that was ruining her makeup. Finally, she let out a jagged breath. Fine, you have 10 minutes, but if you touch the computer housing or scratch the paint, I'll have you arrested and sued into the next century. Am I clear? Mark didn't flinch. He walked toward the car with a grace that didn't match his ragged clothes. He knew this car. He knew the curve of its chassis. He knew the secret language of its cylinders. Because 3 years ago, before the efficiency report had wiped his name from the payroll of Langtech, he was the man who had designed the very heart beating beneath that carbon fiber hood. He was the one who had argued for more robust wiring, only to be overruled by managers who cared more about weight saving and cost cutting. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Every few seconds, a test firework would boom in the distance, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet street. Victoria stood 5 feet back, her arms crossed tightly, watching Mark with a mixture of suspicion and growing anxiety. She couldn't understand why this man, who looked like he hadn't had a warm meal in days, was so calm in the presence of a machine that would take him 3 lifetimes to afford. Mark didn't ask for tools. He didn't ask for a manual. He opened the heavy hood and simply stood there for a moment, eyes closed. He was listening to the cooling fans as they spun down, feeling the heat signature of the block. He was searching for the hiss of a vacuum leak or the click of a failing relay. "What are you doing?" Victoria demanded, her voice sharp with nerves. "Are you praying to it? I told you 10 minutes. If you're just going to stand there and stare, get out of the way." "I'm listening," Mark replied calmly, his voice a stark contrast to her frantic energy. "Every engine has a voice, Ms. Lang. Yours is crying because it's been forced to work under conditions it wasn't designed for. You've been running this at high RPMs in city traffic, haven't you?" Victoria blinked, surprised. "How did you—" "Yes, I was in a hurry." Noah sat on a nearby fire hydrant, watching his father with absolute faith. "10 minutes left, Daddy," he called out, checking his broken toy watch as if it actually told the time. To Noah, this wasn't a billionaire's car. It was just another puzzle for his brilliant father to solve. Mark leaned deep into the engine bay. To Victoria, it looked like a mess of wires and gold-plated components. To Mark, it was a map. He saw a tiny hairline fracture in a proprietary sensor housing, a part that had been redesigned for cost efficiency right before he was fired. It was a flaw he had warned the board about in a memo that was never read. It was a flaw that Victoria herself had dismissed as pessimistic engineering during a quarterly review. "You're wasting time," Victoria said, her voice rising as the cold seeped into her bones. "I should have just waited for the tow truck. Look at you. You're just poking at it with a rusted tool. This is a precision instrument, not a tractor." "I don't have a diagnostic tablet," Mark said, pulling a small rusted multi-tool from his pocket. The only thing he had kept from his old life. "But I have the memory of how this was supposed to be built. Your sensor is sending a false positive to the kill switch. It thinks the engine is melting, so it shut down the fuel pump." A group of revelers in a passing limo slowed down, windows rolling down. A man in a tuxedo, holding a bottle of champagne, pointed at them and laughed. "Hey, lady, did you hire the local hobo to fix your Lambo? Careful, he might swap your V12 for a lawnmower engine, or maybe he's just looking for spare change in the tailpipe." The mockery stung Victoria's pride like a physical blow. She felt humiliated, standing in an alley with a beggar while the world laughed. "That's enough," she said to Mark, her face flushing. "Step away from the car. Now, I'll take my chances with the cold." Mark didn't move. He was focused on a single thin wire. 30 seconds, Ms. Lang. If I'm wrong, I'll walk away and you can call the police. I'll even give you my coat to keep you warm until the truck arrives. But if I'm right, you get to see the fireworks from somewhere better than this sidewalk." "Daddy, the big clock is starting," Noah shouted, pointing to a giant digital display on a skyscraper 3 blocks away. The countdown began. 30, 29, 28. Mark's hands were steady despite the freezing cold. He used a piece of electrical tape from his pocket to bridge a faulty connection, bypassing the sensor that was sending the kill signal. It was a dirty fix, a temporary patch that required a master's understanding of the system's logic. He was essentially performing open-heart surgery with a Band-Aid. 20, 19, 18. Victoria watched his face. She saw a level of concentration she had only seen in the world's top surgeons. There was no greed in his eyes, only the pure, raw desire to see the machine work again. 10, 9, 8. Mark reached in and gave a sharp tug to a lead, locking the tape in place. "Now!" he shouted over the rising noise of the city. "Start it now! Don't wait!" Victoria scrambled into the driver's seat. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She pressed the start button. For a fraction of a second, the starter motor groaned, a low, dying sound that made the crowd in the limo cheer in anticipation of a failure. 3, 2, 1, roar. The engine didn't just start, it exploded into life with a ferocity that shook the surrounding buildings. A perfect, high-pitched mechanical symphony that drowned out the first explosions of the midnight fireworks. The exhaust spat a blue flame, and the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, all systems showing green. The limo sped off, the mockery silenced by the sheer power of the V12. Victoria sat in the cockpit, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She looked at the digital clock. 12 hours, 1 minute. Happy New Year. She looked out the windshield and saw Mark standing in the exhaust haze, breathing heavily, looking like a man who had just wrestled a dragon and won. The sky was a chaotic masterpiece of crimson and gold. Noah was jumping up and down on the fire hydrant, his small voice lost in the thunder of the pyrotechnics. Mark stood by the open hood, his face illuminated by the flashes above. He looked exhausted, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes. The pride of a creator who had seen his creation breathe again. He wiped the oil from his hands onto his pants, a gesture of finality. Victoria stepped out of the car. The cold didn't seem to matter anymore. She walked up to Mark, her silk dress trailing in the slush, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and reverence. "How?" she asked, her voice hushed. "The technicians at the dealership, the best in the world, they said that system was impenetrable. They said if it failed, the entire block had to be replaced for $60,000. They told me it was a safety feature." Mark wiped his hands on a greasy rag he pulled from his pocket. "Technicians follow manuals, Miss Lang. They do what the computer tells them to do. Engineers, true engineers, understand why the manuals were written in the first place. That sensor was a bottleneck designed to save 80 cents per unit. I knew it would fail eventually. I told them 3 years ago." Victoria narrowed her eyes, the billionaire's instinct for patterns kicking in. Something about his phrasing, his confidence, and that specific detail about the sensor price clicked in her mind. "You said you were an engineer. You don't talk like someone who's been away from the field for long. Where did you work?" Mark hesitated. He looked at Noah, who was now staring at a giant firework that looked like a weeping willow. He looked back at the woman whose face was on every screen in the city. "Langtech, Aerospace and Propulsion Division. I was there for 12 years. I was the one who designed the core architecture for the Mark IV hybrid drive." The world seemed to stop spinning for Victoria. The fireworks felt like they were exploding inside her head. "Langtech? That's my company. I know every lead engineer in my primary divisions. I review the payroll personally." "You knew their faces on the efficiency reports, maybe," Mark said, his voice devoid of bitterness, which made the words hurt more than a scream. "I was Mark Dawson, lead architect. I was let go 3 years ago. My wife, Elena, was in the ICU with a rare autoimmune disease. I missed 2 board meetings because I was sleeping on a hospital floor. The HR report said I was unreliable and distracted. You signed the termination letter on a Tuesday. I remember the date because it was the same day the doctors told me she wouldn't make it." Victoria felt a coldness in her chest that had nothing to do with the winter air. She remembered that report. She remembered sitting in her air-conditioned office, drinking a $20 latte, and seeing the name Dawson on a list of 20 engineers to be optimized. She had thought only about the 2% increase in quarterly dividends the layoffs would generate. She had discarded this man like a broken, unimportant part. And tonight, the man she had called useless had saved her using nothing but a roll of tape and a rusted tool. He had protected her when her wealth and her best people had failed her. Mark, I, I didn't know, she started, her voice breaking. For the first time in her life, her billions felt like a heavy, suffocating burden. The reports, they didn't say why you missed the meetings. They just said non-compliance. Mark closed the hood with a gentle click. It's okay, Ms. Lang. It was just business, right? That's what the letter said. We wish you luck in your future endeavors. Well, my future endeavors involve making sure my son doesn't go to bed hungry. Happy New Year. Come on, Noah, let's go home. The pastries are waiting. Wait, Victoria shouted, her voice echoing in the industrial alley. She saw them walking away. The brilliant mind she had crushed and the innocent boy who still thought his father was a king. She realized that if she let them walk into the darkness, she would be losing the only real thing she had encountered in years of corporate artifice. She looked at Noah's shoes, cheap, thin sneakers that were soaking up the icy slush. She looked at the plastic watch. Then she looked at her car, the pinnacle of luxury, saved by a man who had every reason to hate her. I can't let you walk home, she said, her voice cracking with a vulnerability she hadn't felt since she was a child. Please, get in the car, both of you. I'm not asking as your former boss. I'm asking as a person who is freezing and deeply, deeply ashamed. We're fine, ma'am, Mark said, his hand on Noah's shoulder. We're used to the cold. No, you're not, Victoria replied, walking toward them until she was just inches away. And neither am I. I've spent years looking at spreadsheets and forgetting that there are souls behind the numbers. I've been living in a glass tower, and I forgot what the ground feels like. You didn't just fix my car tonight, Mark. You fixed my perspective. Please, let me do something right for once. Let me be the person I thought I was before the money took over. Noah looked at his dad, his eyes wide and hopeful. Can we, Daddy? Can we ride in the rocket car? Just for a little bit? It looks warm in there. Mark looked at Victoria. He saw the genuine remorse in her eyes, the tears that were threatening to ruin her expensive mascara. He saw the human being beneath the billionaire mask. He sighed, the weight of the night finally catching up to him. Okay, Noah, just this once for the rocket car. The interior of the Aventador was a cocoon of warmth and luxury. The leather smelled of success and stability. Noah sat in the front seat, his small hands carefully touching the carbon fiber trim, his eyes wide as he watched the digital displays dancing with light. Victoria didn't drive them to their cramped, drafty apartment in the outskirts. Instead, she took a detour that led them back toward the heart of the city's power. She drove them to the very top of the Langtech Plaza, the highest point in the city, where the executive suites overlooked everything. She led them out onto the private observation deck. The city was a sea of fire and light below them, a shimmering tapestry of human celebration. She had her skeleton crew of holiday staff bring out a spread of food that Noah had only ever seen in the glossy pages of discarded magazines. Steaming hot chocolate with handmade marshmallows, gourmet sliders, and pastries that were still warm from an oven. Mark stood at the railing, looking out at the city he had helped build. He felt like a ghost who had suddenly been granted a body. I tried to find you, Victoria said, standing beside him, her gown fluttering in the high-altitude wind. After the Mark IV went into production and the sensor issues started costing us millions in recalls, I asked about the lead architect. My managers told me you had moved away. They told me you had taken a high-paying job in Europe and weren't interested in coming back. They lied to me to cover up their own mistakes. I was interested in surviving, Mark said quietly, his gaze fixed on a distant bridge. But the industry is small, Victoria. Once you're labeled unreliable by the CEO of Langtech, doors don't just close, they're welded shut. I couldn't even get an interview at a mid-sized firm. I ended up doing freelance repair and manual labor just to keep Noah in school. Victoria looked down at her hands, the diamonds on her fingers feeling like shackles. I'm going to unlock those doors. I'm going to tear them off the hinges. She turned to him, her expression fierce and determined. I'm starting a new division, human-centric engineering. No board of directors to interfere. No efficiency reports based on bloodless metrics. I want you to run it. You won't just be an employee, Mark. You'll be a partner with equity. You'll have the resources to build things that last, things that don't have 80-cent flaws, and you'll have the freedom to be the father Noah deserves. You'll never miss a school play or a doctor's appointment again. That will be written into the foundation of the company. Mark looked at her stunned. The offer was so massive, so life-altering, that he couldn't quite process it. Victoria, I'm just a guy who fixed your car in the snow with some tape. You're overreacting to a single moment. No, she said firmly, placing a hand on his arm. You're the man who saved the soul of my company before I even knew it was dead. You showed me that I was surrounded by yes men who were destroying what I built. I'm not paying you for the repair, Mark. I'm investing in the future I almost threw away. I'm investing in the man who remembered how to be human when I had forgotten. Noah ran over, holding a golden cupcake in one hand and his new tech watch in the other. Daddy, the lady said I can come here whenever I want, and she said I can have a room with a telescope. Is it true? Are we going to live in the clouds? Victoria knelt down to Noah's level, her silk dress brushing the coalstone of the deck. It's more than true, Noah. Your daddy's going to help me make the world better. And you're going to be our chief quality officer. If something isn't good enough for you, it isn't good enough for the world. How does that sound? Noah grinned, his face smeared with chocolate, his eyes shining brighter than the fireworks. Does that mean I get a real watch that tells the time? A real one? Victoria laughed, a genuine warm sound that felt like the first real thing she had done in years. She reached into her bag and pulled out a limited edition tech watch, a prototype that hadn't even hit the market, capable of tracking everything from heart rate to satellite positions. She strapped it to his wrist. Consider it your first day's pay, Officer Noah. It tells the time, and it even tells you when the next meteor shower is coming. The following months were a whirlwind of change that captivated the entire tech industry. Mark Dawson didn't just return to the world of engineering, he conquered it. But he did it on his own terms, with a quiet authority that commanded respect from even the most cynical executives. His office wasn't a glass cage. It was a sprawling, sunlit workshop where the smell of oil and ozone mixed with the sound of laughter. His son, Noah, was a permanent fixture, often seen testing new materials or asking engineers questions that forced them to think outside the box. Mark implemented a revolutionary family-first policy. He ensured that no employee would ever be fired for a family distraction. He built a daycare center in the heart of the R&D wing and created a scholarship fund for the children of the staff. He proved that a company could be profitable and compassionate at the same time, that the efficiency of a human soul was worth more than a 2% dividend. Victoria changed too. She stepped down from the gala circuit and the hollow socialite life. She became the face of a new kind of capitalism, one that valued the craftsman as much as the craft. She and Mark became the most formidable duo in the industry. Their partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect in the shared memory of a cold night in an industrial alley. They proved that integrity was the most valuable asset a company could own, and that the best ideas often come from the people the world tries to ignore. On the next New Year's Eve, exactly 1 year after their fateful meeting, Mark and Noah didn't walk home in the snow. They stood on the same observation deck at the Langtech Plaza, but this time they weren't guests, they were owners. They weren't ghosts, they were the heartbeat of the city. Mark looked down at his hands. They were still stained with a bit of grease from a project he had been working on with Noah that afternoon. He looked at Victoria, who was laughing with Noah as they watched the first fireworks of the new year. The lesson they learned in that freezing industrial lot stayed with them forever, a guiding light in a world that often prefers the dark. It was a simple truth, but one that changed everything. A small act of kindness, a moment of humbleness, can trigger a chain reaction that reshapes the world. Never judge a man by the grease on his hands or the holes in his coat, for those might be the very hands that hold the key to your future. Two strangers met in a moment neither was prepared for. One saved a car from a cold night, the other saved a man from a cold life. And together they built a legacy of kindness that would burn brighter than any firework, a story that would be told for generations to come. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment and subscribe to Kind Single Father. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.